You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. We won't know until early June what decision will be made by the Supreme Court regarding Roe v. Wade, and for that matter, the follow-up case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. We did, however, hear the oral arguments made by both sides last week, and my reading of the tea leaves is that the court, given its highly conservative majority, is inclined to uphold Mississippi's 15-week abortion ban, a major shift in abortion jurisprudence. Kavanaugh actually stated, quote, "You have to pick between the interest of pregnant women and the fetus. One interest has to prevail." Close quote. Alito, on the issue of viability, said that the fetus, quote, "has an interest in having a life." Close quote. Amy Coney Barrett, who herself has 7 children, questioned why safe haven laws, which protect parents who surrender unwanted infants to, for example, hospitals, protect them against criminal prosecution, don't just resolve the burdens of parenting, emphasized in both Roe and in Casey. What's not to like? And the Solicitor General from Mississippi argued that Roe and Casey haunt our country and have no home in our history or tradition. We'd rather not argue the Constitution, obviously. And that he added that abortion access is more accessible and more affordable these days, so it's no undue burden. By the way, a procedure in Mississippi costs $600 minimum, plus time off from work, plus food and gas and lodging, and possibly travel and child care costs. Julie Rickman of the Center for Reproductive Rights, who was brilliantly representing the abortion provider who sued, noted that Mississippi law would do profound damage to women's liberty, equality, and the rule of law. And equally brilliant, U.S. Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar, arguing for the Biden administration's Justice Department on behalf of the provider, noted that the real-world effects of overruling Roe and Casey would be severe and swift. Our special hero, however, was Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who warned that the court would risk losing legitimacy if it overturned Roe, and who dared ask, will this institution survive the stench that this creates in the public perception that the Constitution and its reading are just political acts? Close quote. Until June. Now, this week we here are going to dare plunge into vigilantism. It isn't new, you know. It has a long history, both internationally and particularly in the United States. And since we seem to have recently fallen prey to, and even currently are under the threat of, this bizarre phenomenon, we had better understand what it's really all about. Vigilantes have been glamorized by popular culture, analyzed by scholars, idolized by self-proclaimed patriots, avengers, revengers, moralists, religious extremists, and other pseudo-heroic types, and feared. Fear is the crucial part, and it's essential to vigilantism as a means of social control. Not surprisingly, although not exclusively, manhood is, as you might suspect, quite a contributing factor. So before we go anywhere else, we need to go inside the headlines. The word vigilante entered English in the 19th century, borrowed from the Spanish word, which meant watchman or guard, and which can be traced back to the Latin vigilare, meaning to stay awake. Vigilantism is the active enforcement, investigation, or punishment of perceived, important word, perceived offenses without any legal authority to do so. The vigilante ethos existed long before the word was introduced into English. There are conceptual parallels between the Dark Ages, with the medieval aristocratic custom of private war or vendetta, and modern vigilante philosophy. Elements of the concept can be found throughout the Bible, for example, in Genesis 34, in the account of the abduction and rape of Dinah, daughter of Jacob, and the violent reaction of her brothers, who slew all the males of the rapist's city in revenge. Similarly, in 2 Samuel 13, Absalom kills his own brother Amnon, after King David, their father, fails to punish Amnon for having raped Tamar, their sister. During medieval times, punishment of felons was sometimes meted out by secret societies, like the courts of the Vehm, that's V-E-H-M. They were the medieval Sardinian Gamurra, which later became the Sicilian Vendicatore and the Beati Paoli. Modern vigilantism could be said to have descended from the Saxon tradition of frank pledge. Throughout the early Middle Ages and High Middle Ages, frank pledge was a system of joint suretyship common in England, the compulsory sharing of responsibility among persons connected in units termed tithings. This unit, under its leader or tithing man, was responsible for producing any man of the tithing suspected of a crime. If he did not appear, the entire group would be fined. While women, clergy, the rich, and freemen, all of them fairly few, were exempt, all other males over age 12 were involved. 12th century figures like William of Malmesbury were keen to link this to the laws of Canute the Great. William the Conqueror played a vital role by making the tithings adopt compulsory frank pledge so as to increase the power of the Normans. The frank pledge system began to decline in the 14th century due to the extension of centralized royal administration and the increasing appropriation of frank pledge by private landlords, a process exacerbated by the impact of the Black Death, the plague. Power and violence were becoming more official. The United States inherited England's Anglo-Saxon common law and its system of social obligation, sheriffs, constables, watchmen, and stipendiary justice. After the founding of the United States, a citizen's arrest became known as a procedure based in common law, as a frontier response to both the threat and the reality of crime. The first settlers who moved to the Deep South and the West weren't protected by a criminal justice system. No law enforcement agencies, no regularly scheduled court sessions, no nearby jails or prisons, and vast open spaces where offenders could easily escape from their victims. As both societies, England and the United States, became less agrarian and more urban, and more industrialized as well, crime, riots, and other public disturbances became more common. Yet Americans, like the English, were wary of creating standing police forces. Among the first public police forces established in colonial North America was one with a watchman, organized in Boston in 1631, and one in New Amsterdam, later New York City, in 1647. Watchmen were paid a fee in both cities, but most policing officers in colonial America were private citizens. In the absence of formal legal systems, correctional facilities, or institutional policing mechanisms, victims and their allies felt periodically compelled to track down outlaws. Vigilance committees were voluntary associations of men, rarely including women, who worked together to combat real, exaggerated, or imagined dangers to their communities, their families, their property, or their privileges. These organizations usually had formal hierarchies, defined chains of command, written bylaws, and paramilitary rituals, and their leadership typically was drawn from the elite of frontier society: businessmen, plantation owners, ranchers, merchants, and professionals. Members were recruited from the middle strata. The targets of their wrath generally were from the lower classes and from marginal groups, and this has persisted into the 21st century. Vigilantes blacklisted, harassed, banished, flogged, tarred and feathered, tortured, mutilated, and murdered their victims. Lynchings were originally public whippings carried out in Virginia in the late 1700s by a committee led by one Colonel Lynch. That was his name. As time passed and violent punishments meted out by vigilante bands escalated, the expression came to mean summary execution. Vigilantes who acted as part of a committee or mob could conceal their identities when shrouded by darkness or disguised by hoods, masks, or uniforms. Acting in concert furthermore bolstered their courage and diminished their sense of individual culpability for the suffering inflicted, as well as eliminating their risk of getting caught and punished. Vigilantism has remained and still remains an international act as well as a domestic one. In the 1920s, the Big Sword Society of China protected life and property in a state of anarchy. In the early 20th century, the White Finns founded the Suo Gelus Kunta Protection Corps as a paramilitary vigilante organization in Finland. It later formed the nucleus of the White Army in the Finnish Civil War. Since the 1980s, Sombra Negra, or Black Shadow of El Salvador, is a group of retired police officers and military personnel whose sole duty it is to cleanse the country of so-called impure social elements by killing criminals and gang members. Sombra Negra is a remnant of the death squads of the 1970s and 80s. And so it goes. Anti-fascist action vigilantes in Sweden and pro-fascist vigilante groups in Bavaria. Yekaterinburg, Russia's city without drugs vigilantes beating and murdering drug dealers in the 1990s, the underground groups against gangsterism and drugs of Cape Town, South Africa, the Bakassi Boys of Nigeria, and the Los Pepes group in Colombia committing acts of vigilantism against drug lord Pablo Escobar. So it's not always bad, or is it? In its own long fight for independence, Northern Ireland has spawned many such groups, from the Irish National Liberation Army through the Real Irish Republican Army, the Continuity Irish Republican Army, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, and the Irish National Liberation Army, all of which sounds like a comic Monty Python movie, except that each in turn administered beatings, kneecappings, and murders of any suspected criminal or drug dealer, or suspected disloyal member or British sympathizer. Under the harsh rule of strongman Duterte in the Philippines, Duterte himself has been accused of being linked to vigilante death squads, and he has not denied it. Again, you almost never see women forming such groups, but when they do, they can be quite ruthless. In 2004, 200 women from Kasturba Nagar, India, hacked to death a man they say raped them with impunity for more than a decade. Flatly put, secure, content citizens don't resort to vigilante action. It cannot thrive in societies where appropriate resources and skill are brought to bear on the administration of criminal justice through proper and adequate provision and training of policing, prosecution services, courts of law, and correctional facilities. Lessen any of these elements, and you release the forces of human exaggeration, vengeance, jealousy, rage, the blood hunt, the personal intoxicating rush felt by inducing fear in others, and similar such poisons in the human soul. Then cry havoc, and let slip the dogs of war. It's time for our first break, but don't go anywhere because coming up is the Surrealism Corner. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Okay, Robin Hood, but the Ku Klux Klan? Batman, sure, but the Irish paramilitary army? We must be in the surrealism corner. I'm afraid the resemblance isn't limited to peaked pointy hats and face masks. Robin Hood, the 13th century folklore outlaw, supposedly stole from the rich and gave to the poor, but that's folklore. And he likely was an ordinary thief escaped to the greensward, his merry men a bunch of drunken louts, and Maid Marian an enabler. There they all are, Superman, Batman, and Robin, too. Clyde Shelton, the character from the movie Law-Abiding Citizen. Almost every role Clint Eastwood has ever played. Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver. Right on up to today with the hit TV series Dexter, about a lovable vigilante who is a serial killer. Apparently, most people prefer a villain to a good guy. More interesting. After all, Lucifer is certainly the most interesting character in Paradise Lost. But leaving great poetry aside, the glamorization of the vigilante looms huge in our culture. Here are the ways I described him in my book, The Demon Lover. His mystique is the latest version of the demon lover. He evokes pity because he lives in death. He emanates sexual power because he represents obliteration. He excites with the thrill of fear. He is the essential challenge to tenderness. He is at once a hero of risk and an anti-hero of mortality. He straps 100 pounds of weaponry to his body, larger than life on the film screen. He wears the most opaque sunglasses. Whatever he dons becomes a uniform. He is a living weapon. Whatever he does at first appalls, then becomes faddish. We are told that women lust to have him. We are told that men lust to be him. We have all of us invoked him for centuries, and now he has become every man. This is the democratization of violence. There he stands, garbed in black, his face in shadow or masked by a balaclava, his body not only bearing the magic tools of death, but a magic tool of death itself. He's a fanatic of dedication, a mixture of impetuosity and discipline, desperate and therefore vulnerable, totally at risk and therefore brave, an idealist yet a hardened realist. Most of all, he is given over wholly to a passion. But his passion is death. He is what passes for manhood. Now, I was actually describing the so-called terrorist, but frankly it works perfectly as well for the vigilante. Some scholars have argued that vigilantism should be clearly distinguished from domestic terrorism because their purposes supposedly differ sharply. A guy named W.C. Culberson writes that domestic terror involves actions that deny the progression of the social order, while vigilantism is conducted by people vigilant in matters that could harm the progressive social order. It all depends on your view, Culberson. There is an unapologetically subjective judgment for you. Moreover, and here is a special hook vigilante defenders rely on, equating the phenomenon with domestic terrorism apparently denies the people's rights to criticize or challenge the status quo or the direction of social policies. In other words, when in doubt, summon that amorphous, vague, ectoplasmic body called the people to your aid. The justices just did this last week in saying it wasn't so bad to throw it back to the states because then the people could decide and the court would remain impartial. Yet the so-called posse planning to kidnap and summarily execute Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan were flat-out criminal vigilantes. So are the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and the rest of the Nazoid crazies who overdosed on testosterone and besieged the Capitol in January of last year. Not all of Hollywood's makeup, hair, and drama coaches can glamorize such pathetic perfidy. Oh, and by the way, here's an item really worthy of the Surrealism Corner. Edward Durfee, Jr., who was a member of the far-right militia and was at the Capitol on January 6, just ran for the New Jersey State Assembly as a Republican. He leads the Republican committee in the town where he lives, underscoring the extent to which right-wing activism has become increasingly mainstream within the GOP, even in a Democratic stronghold like Bergen County, less than 30 miles from Manhattan. The Oath Keepers, of which he is part, draw their members from the ranks of former military and law enforcement personnel and have links to active duty police officers and government officials. Durfee, who ran unopposed in the primary, admits, quote, "I'm on the ballot because nobody challenged me. There is that lack of participation among our citizens." Close quote. That lack of participation. Durfee is one of dozens of Oath Keepers across the country who are already in office or are running for election, nearly all Republicans, according to a ProPublica analysis. A devotee of the libertarian Ron Paul, Durfee speaks openly about his involvement with the Oath Keepers, which he says he joined in 2009, the same year it was founded, following directly on the election of former President Barack Obama. And racism isn't involved? A grandfather of 3 who opposes abortion, Durfee is an ardent Catholic and a 4th-degree member of the Knights of Columbus, which is a rank given for patriotism. Well, holy baloney, Batman. You sure got great toys and cars and caves, and a sidekick, too, but you and Clint and Travis and Superman, even V for Vendetta, better remain imaginary, because despite the hype and glamour attendant on you, you're simply not viable citizens. You are surreal. We have to pause here for a moment for our final break, but then I'll be back directly with some fighting words. The Women's Media Center, founded in 2005 by Jane Fonda, Gloria Steinem, and myself, is a progressive, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to make women visible and powerful in media. You can learn more about the WMC at womensmediacenter.com.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
No matter the eye of the beholder and how tolerant, vigilante is a fighting word. Although it feels upsetting to even say it, some vigilantes have good intentions and believe they are bettering their communities by protecting the vulnerable, like spontaneous uprisings against intolerable conditions in enslaved communities or colonial regimes. But that is not usually the case. In fact, it's rarely the case. And even when it is, such groups or committees quite rapidly try to legitimize themselves by transforming themselves into regular forces or even armies. Most vigilante efforts include targeting the poor, the powerless, people of color, and other disenfranchised groups that the vigilante feels simply have no right to exist. This is why vigilantism is dangerous. Being a vigilante is not technically illegal, but virtually every aspect of vigilantism is. Such actions are motivated by strong feelings that the vigilante must intervene to obtain justice. Yet most vigilantism also describes a state of chaos and lawlessness, especially when groups like opposing gangs compete. Each claims, of course, that they are the good guys, acting only in the absence of any government or official action. Yet many, if not most, are intensely opposed to government or other official action. Other such motivations include a personal agenda to protest existing laws that the vigilante finds unacceptable, or enforcing existing laws with far harsher punishments for those the vigilante feels should be more harshly punished, or attributing such actions to one's belief in a higher law. It's important to distinguish vigilantism from neighborhood watches, too. Such watches are supposed to literally just watch, and if or when witnessing malfeasance, report that to the police for the police to handle. Only if a neighborhood watch takes matters into its own hands and does not share the information with local peace officers is it considered an act of vigilantism. Vigilantes have taken advantage of the opportunistic confusion surrounding motivation. Sure, some have been involved in struggles for independence, but there is a clear distinction between force employed in self-defense and the intent to inflict punishment and pain as an avenger, as well as the recognition that the remedies so undertaken happen to be illegal. This all gets rather muddled when the participants are partly or wholly comprised of former military personnel, paramilitary personnel, and retired police, security guards, and other law enforcement officers. It's as if these men cannot relinquish the power that they see that comes from the gun and the strut and the telling other people what to do. There is a disproportionately high number of lawmen involved in vigilantism, and the long history of collaboration between the outlaws and law enforcement itself is deep and very alarming. It was recently noted in the Kenosha, Wisconsin trial of Kyle Rittenhouse for the murder of 2 men. Rittenhouse was found not guilty and was treated almost deferentially by law enforcement. It's been a long and exceedingly difficult road on which civilization has stumbled toward the law. And the law, while highly imperfect, is really quite something in its majesty. It is the history of human thought evolving, encoded in advice. Central to that evolution is the concept of balance of power, since hewing toward any one approach without that balance, sooner or later, leads to totalitarianism. But a balance of power is not the only core of our democracy, thanks to the genius of the founders. It is also there in the enumeration of tasks. So when, for example, vigilante committees absorb into themselves the combined responsibilities of all-in-one judge, jury, and executioner, that's where everything goes very wrong very fast. From the plantation owners who assign to themselves the duties of torture and murder of enslaved people in the American South, to the spontaneous raids against indigenous peoples, From the Oath Keepers to the Irish paramilitary armies, from the Minutemen Project and the group Ranch Rescue, both still functioning today in the Southwest to expel people who cross the Mexican border and remove immigrants and squatters from ranchers' properties, to the Texas bounty hunter, those vigilantes who turn in women pursuing their simple constitutional right to end a pregnancy. In all of these cases, that all-in-one, judge, jury, and executioner, is despicable. Here is the voice of Louise Clapp, wife of a physician who lived in the mining area known as Indian Bar. It bordered on the Feather River in Northern California, and the year was 1851. She wrote a number of letters to her sister in Massachusetts, describing her experience. The letters were originally published in Pioneer magazine in 1854, and then in a book in 1922, a copy of which resides in the Library of Congress. Here is an excerpt of Louise's voice on the reality of vigilantism in a letter written on December 14th, 1851. Last fall, 2 men were arrested by their partners on suspicion of having stolen from them $1,800 in gold dust. The evidence was not sufficient to convict them, and they were acquitted. They were tried before a meeting of the miners, as at that time the law did not even pretend to wave its scepter over this place. The prosecutors still believed them guilty, and fancied that the gold was hidden in a coyote hole near the camp from which it had been taken. They made no discoveries, however, and the acquitted men left the mountains for Marysville. A few weeks later, one of them returned, and has spent most of the time since his arrival in loafing about, constantly intoxicated. Louise continues in detail about the miners following the men to the coyote hole and eventually finding the money. Armed with this evidence of guilt, she writes, the miners confronted and accused him. He did not attempt a denial. A meeting of the miners was convened, the unhappy man taken into custody, a jury chosen, and a judge, lawyer, etc. appointed. At 1 o'clock, so rapidly was the trial conducted, the judge charged the jury and insinuated they could do no less than to bring in their verdict of guilty. After a few minutes' absence, the 12 men who had consented to burden their souls with that responsibility returned, and the foreman handed the judge a paper which read as follows: that William Brown, convicted of stealing, should in 1 hour from that time be hung by the neck until he was dead. By the persuasions of some men more mildly disposed, they granted him a respite of 3 hours to prepare for his entrance into eternity. He employed the time in writing in his native language, he is a Swede, to friends in Stockholm. God help them when that fatal post shall arrive, for no doubt he also, though a criminal, was fondly garnered in many a loving heart. The execution was conducted by the jury and performed by throwing the cord, one end of which was attached to the neck of the prisoner, across the limb of a tree standing outside of the Rich Bar graveyard. The whole affair was a piece of cruel butchery, though that was not intentional but arose from the ignorance of those who made the preparations. In truth, life was only crushed out of him by hauling the writhing body up and down several times in succession by the rope which was wound round a large bough of his green-leaved gallows. Almost everybody was surprised at the severity of the sentence, and many with their hands on the cord did not believe even then that it would be carried into effect, but thought that at the last moment the jury surely would release the prisoner and substitute a milder punishment. The crowd generally seemed to feel the solemnity, but many laughed and shouted as if it were a spectacle got up for their particular amusement. The body of the criminal was allowed to hang for some hours after the execution. It had commenced storming in the early part of the evening, and when those whose business it was to inter the remains arrived, they found them enwrapped in a soft white shroud of feathery snowflakes, as if pitying nature had tried to hide from the offended face of heaven the cruel deed her mountain children had committed. That is the reality of vigilante justice. Those are my fighting words. Add yours on Twitter, and remember to tag us at WMC Live and use the hashtag #FightingWords. And that's our show for this week. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and now Instagram at @TheRobinMorgan, and you can check out my blog at robinmorgan.net and find my latest book of poems, Dark Matter, and my brand new novel, Parallax, wherever books are sold. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the Women's Media Center. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. Executive producer as well as founding and sustaining sponsor Regina K. Scully, WMC president and co-executive producer of this program Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us again next time on Women's Media Center Live.